Hello everyone, and welcome to the 12th in our series, Seminar on Self. This is your philosopher at large, Tristan McGough. I'm here with all the Cogno cards that have been created with your help over the last year or so as we've delved into selfology, that is, the study of self. Now, if there's one thing that you've taken away from the various sessions that we've held, it's that the self is not a single phenomenon in the sense that it is finite or atom-like or indivisible or permanent or something that is unchanging. In fact, as we've spoken of, quite the reverse, the self is so multidimensional. Remember, we spoke of 10 dimensions, that it cannot be reduced one to the other. Nor can you entirely reduce being to consciousness or consciousness to the void, or the void to finite being. These are all four quadrants that go into the recipe of reality, as we've discussed. So there's pure being, finite being, conscious being, and non-being. And from moment to moment, in the eternal now, structured, if you will, within the framework of the epistemic relation between the subject and the object, that gives us the creation of an outer scape as well as an inner scape, where our psychic and solar dimensions reign. We speak of the one self, and at the same time we speak of the 10-dimensional self. And there may seem to be a contradiction. However, we have to realize that we are observing the one fact of reality from different angles, through different lenses, sometimes different methodologies. The methodology that we're examining now is dialogic. I'm using a dialogue format, specifically in terms of a monologue, in order not just to impart information, but in this last of the seminar series, it is not just a summary of what we've covered, it's a synthesis. It should take you to an apex, to a point where you understand that the self, though viewed from very many different angles according to the dimensions in which you're investigating the self, or whether you're dealing with the macrocosmic self or the microcosmic self, your individual self, are all the little selves which compose you as a microcosm. Think of all the billions of cells and quadrillions of molecules, atoms, subatomic particles that go just in to constitute the physical body. That physical body, which when we were looking at the ontography of dimensionalized existence, we pointed out was simply merely the biotic, or the lowest level of manifestation of energy and matter. All this is energy in matter. It's at different grades and different levels of functionability. Just as atoms compose molecules, molecules go on to compose greater things into this manifest world. Those very atoms themselves are composed of subatomic particles. Physicists believe that with instrumentation and their mathematical equations that they've accounted virtually for all the energy and matter and transformative states, I would be thinking, within this rubric plane here of the biotic realm. The vital, incidentally, in terms of theosophical conceptualization of the constitution of the planes of being, envisages that the vital realm is that very subatomic realm. They call it the etheric realm. But both of those together constitute the physical realm, both the corporeal, which we see, which are the three states of matter we know of and we easily see, that is, the solid, the liquid, and the gaseous, but of course there's an admittedly fourth state, the plasmic, such as lightning. And more subtle that matter becomes, the more potent energy it has. And consequently, the higher that you move into the realms of being, that is on the subatomic particle level, and you keep becoming more and more refined in terms of what you might call the infinitesimality of direction, the disappearance in the point, which is why we use the omniversal model, the Om, for both description and explanation, because not only is it the most parsimonious when it comes to explaining the quadrupled nature of reality by way of this recipe of reality of pure and finite being as well as conscious and non-being, but it allows us to, if you will, turn the inside out and the outside in for conceptual reference. In the same way that none of these as graphic depictions of concepts or theories or sub-theories or integrations of concepts of other theories plus novel theories, however we describe these depictions, none of them, of course, are the actual lemma or meaning or mental object that I behold or you behold when I say such things as the self consists of will, love, mind, and life. When I assert those things in a proposition, it's something that we can fix. It's something that we can state and articulate within space and time. But that's not to be confused with the actual mental object that I behold when I'm describing or unpacking that word, self, which refers at the same time to the meaning of self and to whatever selves happen to exist as entities in this world of space, time, entity, and causation. You'll remember we began, therefore, with the omniversal model, and we spoke of the microcosmic self being divided into three aspects. The personality that we usually know of and we have no problem with identifying in our everyday life. This is the realm, the empirical self. This empiric self is composed of your finite thoughts, finite actions, finite words, finite feelings that come and go, finite intents and resolutions, and anything else that is created as a behavioral event in your life. That's the person, that's the empiric self. And when psychologists are analyzing this self, they speak of the empirical ego. That is the subject that is necessary and is actually concretely engaged in beholding objects, or holding objects, or walking over objects, or speaking about objects, etc., etc. So this is all the realm of the personality. It's the empiric self. However, for that empiric self to actually exist, there is an ever-present epistemic relationship between the noema, the object, and the noesis, the cognition, the cognizer. This relationship of object, which is beheld, and the beholder of the object, which we call the subject, that relationship is fundamental to any empirical experience in the world. And to understand fully the expanded human constitution, you must realize that the empiric self depends for its very existence upon the experiencing of the subject in actual relation with an object. There's always contact that is taking place. And the basis of that is the epistic self. Some call it the soul. It is your self-consciousness, your awareness of yourself. It's what allows you to have the clarity, the intuitive clarity, that you know what you're thinking, even if it's something you don't want to think about. To know what you're feeling, even if it's something you do not want to feel, such as pain or despair or a sense of loss. There is no doubt in your mind of yourself that you have an intuitive, clear recognition of that pain. The same thing with doubt. You may say to yourself, well, I think I believe this. But you actually know that in terms of belief, you may be 90% there in terms of belief, in terms of being able to propositionalize yourself through inference that this is the correct belief to hold, and only 10% with a divided mind. And it's that way very often with beliefs and other things, including sentiments. You may often have a ratio of sentiment, right? Because along any scalar, polar scale, from good to bad or whatever, there's a range in between. And this area is where most of us inhabit, such as with the 10 special intelligences. We spoke of those quite often. Let's see here. If we can find them on the board, I do know I listed them for, here we go, for the last session. The 10 types of special intelligence. And we began, and we spoke of visual intelligence, which of course, this artistic intelligence, there's a certain amount of visual intelligence here, and you have to have a certain amount of visual intelligence just to apprehend and to understand some of this graphic intelligence, if you will, that I'm attempting to portray here from a philosophically mental level down here onto a physical, visual one. But then we have linguistic competence as well, and logical and kinesthetic, such as with athletics and athletes. The naturalistic, such as ecologists and people who love nature. Musical. And then, of course, we come to what are the existential, that is the life smarts, the things that people learn just in their day-by-day contact with others. And then, of course, we have interpersonal smarts, and that is your social IQ. And then there's intrapersonal or intrapsychic smarts, and that relates to how well do you know yourself in terms of your 10 dimensions? How well are you acquainted with your feeling self, your narrating self, your volitional self, that is the self that makes the decisions in terms of the actual will power, right? Often our decisions, or what we call resolutions, are nothing more than a mental exercise that we use to allay our doubt. And that's why New Year's resolutions so often fail, because when we can allay our doubt by making these, if you will, jury resolutions at the end of the year, then we can enjoy all the holidays, the whole bevy of holidays that come in the holiday season, and we don't have to be plagued by doubts. And then, of course, January 1st comes, you made your resolution that you're not going to eat chocolate mousse any longer, and you find yourself eating chocolate mousse to celebrate the new year. So, you allayed your doubt, but at the same time, you had your mousse and you ate it too. So as we move through a conceptualization of what the self actually is in its 10 dimensions, let us never forget that the highest dimension of self is the one self, the identifying self. And there's only one kind of identity, and that's self-identity. There's no other kind of identity. You can say A equals A, but A better be A in order for A to equal A. If I am going to write on a chalkboard A equals A, this A equals this A, technically that is not correct. This particular token called an A that I wrote on the chalkboard, now we're writing in our imaginations, and this A, which I wrote to my left, or pardon me, your left, my right, and the equal sign in between, all of those were made up of material elements, and each one of them are absolutely distinct. So this A as a shape, and this A as a shape, as something called shapes in the alphabet that we distill abstractly into our minds as lemmas, as these meanings, well, those are not material. However, the tokens that I write, they're types. The tokens that I write, those are material. Each one of them is composed of particular elements. And that, of course, is what led us to an understanding, as we had discussed it, as what constitutes really the stories in our lives. What are the stories we keep repeating that define ourselves? Rather than looking at ourselves as the one self, we don't very often do that, except at moments of high satori or ecstasy or perfect calmness of being and mind. And at that point, then sometimes we glimpse the oneness of all. Remember, Heraclitus' first fragment, he says, "Not by my authority, but upon that of truth, you should accept the fact that all things are one." This is the same man who had said one could not step into the same river twice, meaning, and he said it quite succinctly, he said all is change, only change is changeless. Now you see that all here. The self is ever changing. But yet the part of the self that is never ever changing is self-identity. There's no question you know who yourself is. You know who you are. You intuitively know who you are. It doesn't mean that when you know somebody else, or even when you know yourself, that you know what you are. Doesn't mean that you know all your feelings. You may have some hidden feelings, right? In the subliminal areas, the unconscious areas that are repressed, that may never come to light, or may only come to light through some kind of therapy. That is where you're made whole. Whether you make yourself whole through going to the center of consciousness, which is what meditation means. When you go there, you learn that that is your refuge. Remember the Buddha. He admonished his disciples. He says, "Be ye refuge unto yourself." Can there be any other? He's quite clear about that. So at some point, whatever external guides you have in this outer scape, however helpful they may be to you, either as gurus, as friends, as lovers and lights in your life, eventually you become your own guide. You understand that whatever empirical things that you have experienced in this finite world, there has always been that trans-finite soul that has continued. And we remember that's one of the dimensions, the continuing self. Chitta-santana, the stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness is unbroken, undividable. Therefore, you can divide it at any point. Just like the point is dimensionless, therefore it can appear anywhere. And that's exactly what happens when we start speaking of the human being as an empirical and epistic aggregate, we realize that the objects and the subject do not exist in abstracto, that is, as some kind of separate things. Everything coexists interdependently as part of one single reality, oneself. When I say I brought these boards to show you, what I'm actually doing is just arranging through language the way my empiric self has moved through space-time, cause and effect and entity, and taking you as entities into account when I present these. That's all empirical. But I know the whole time it's been me continuously doing that through that epistic relationship of subject and object. I've never been without being in the arms of objects. As Sartre says, consciousness borrows being. Right? Being in nothingness, being in consciousness. That's why I do arrange over here when we're speaking about the constitutionalization of reality, why I place Purusha, or pure consciousness, along with Abhava, nothingness, the void. Absolute clarity, of which there are 5 types. Remember, we were speaking of nothingness and its 5 types, and they're all correlative to the other types of the ingredients to reality. But there's a lot of nothingness that just took place here. Things that I've done now have an annihilative non-being or non-existence. Once I leave that spot, I've annihilated my being on that spot. And before I go over here, before that actually happens, there is an antecedent non-existence. I'm not over there yet. It's antecedent to me going and actually existing here. But before I existed here, it was an antecedent non-existence. Now, what is an antecedent non-existence? Well, it has a beginning. Pardon me. My antecedent non-existence did have a beginning. That is, at this point. When I walked to this point, I ended annihilatively all the others. However, in terms of the antecedent non-existence, it began the moment that I existed in this spot, right? Watch one of the earlier seminars in which we did cover the whole concept of being in terms of infinite and finite being, conscious and non-being, and where I discussed a little more in depth about if you were looking at the various aspects such as the unmanifest and the universal. We spoke of eternity, affinity, totality, and purity. And in the same way, when you're speaking about the modes of non-being, we did refer here to antecedent non-being and annihilative non-being. However, there are 3 others that we did discuss in those seminars. And I am not going to be able to drill down today with you here in this last of the seminar on everything that we have went over in the last 11. However, what is important to understand is that given the wealth, the treasury of what constitutes a human being, it is most important that an individual take themselves seriously enough to examine their life. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Worthwhileness, in other words, comes from our examination. And the Buddha himself, did he not say that you have to use your reason? Don't believe on it for tradition's sake, or because it was handed to you, or somebody told it to you, that's an authority, or you've been believing it because it's a collective belief handed to you through a doctrine, dogma, religion. It doesn't matter. Even theoretical physics has its own form of adherence to belief, which amounts to an equivalent of a religion. Why? Because we're all feeling beings, and we have affection for the things, the ideas that we establish, evolve, and advance by. So when we look at the self in its various dimensions, we began and we will conclude with a review of these 10 dimensions to the self. The first we said was the bodily self, and those we divided into sets of active and passive senses. Right, I've got my 5 passive senses, so I can hear, touch, smell, taste, etc. And then we've got the active senses, locomotion, manipulation, speech, the others. All of these constitute a sense of a living self, a bodily self, a vital self. When we prick ourselves, we say, I'm in pain. If we fall, we say, I fell down. So that is the self as our identity as it identifies with the body, the bodily self. We also saw how important the perspectival self is, because really that's where the ecologue begins. I have a perspective as a subject through this epistemic relation of the epistic self, where I'm always engaged, always in contact with some realm of being or another, either in the outer scape, through my senses, these 10 senses, or through my inner scape, where I can build my own world, and I have built my own world, and we all build our own worlds, and that's the world that we inhabit. The rest of this is often either a representation of that world we're thinking about or feeling, or that we're actively engaged in willing, or that we spend our time in doing, such as contemplatives. Contemplatives doing consists of a great deal of mentation and a great deal of contemplation. That is a type of doing. Doing happens on all the dimensions. Just like feeling on all the dimensions. Willing on all the dimensions. Right now, as I stand before you, you can't look and say, well, let me look at the mental dimension and see it in operation. You're seeing it in operation in the manifest world because, as we so clearly pointed out last time, there is a process by which the present is revealed as the presentation. And as I search for it here, I am looking for the one chart that will allow us to unpack that present. So if you see it, here it is. Presencing the present. The gift from the universe to you as you. So what's the present again? It's the one presence that is presencing itself through the presentation. This is the presentation down here. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is Maya. This is metered matter. This is massification. So our senses, remember, we only can see part of the visible spectrum. We can only feel part of the tangible world. There's a lot more tangibility than just what it is that any one of us as a human being can touch. Do you know what it's like to touch up against an atom or a molecule as spacious as they are and as far apart as you and I are, yet with no dimensions, when we touch our bodies, we go, I touched you. How does that feel? That's part of your feeling self. But it all begins with that perspective. We all have that perspective of the subject by which we filter the world through our feelings, our thoughts, the intents, the dogmas we hold, the prejudices we cling to, the values that we interpret the world by, as well as the meanings and the purposes that we apprehend. So as we were looking at the present, let us understand that the presentation can occur at any particular level. Any particular level is a presentation. All I am attempting to do here is not show the lowest end here of material reality. I'm simply saying that anytime there's a presentation as I'm giving you here, there's the present moment, there's the presented object, there's the act of presenting, but first of all, there's presentivity, which is the potential for the being to become what it is. That is, for what is part of the one presence through presencing to become part of the presentation. So we have all of these elements that go into the present. The present is not just an object, it's not just what is present, it's not just the time, it's not just the present moment, it's not just the possibility of there being a present, so that there can actually be a present. But there's then the actual doing, the presenting that takes place. And all of this is an aspect of presencing. And it's this presencing that Yogananda, Paramahansa Yogananda, calls attention to when he says the secret of happiness is the consciousness of the presence of God. What he's referring to is that God, or the ground, is what bases us in this world as empirical beings. So besides the empiric self, the finite self that we see in this outer scape, and the epistic self, which we don't see but yet we apprehend on the inner scape through our self-evident intuition, both of those are based on the agnostic self. That is the self that is already holding all subjects and all subjects together interconnectively in a web that not only is intraplanar, such as all the material objects here are connected through entanglement as well as through local causality. It's not only happening here that there's entanglement and local causality, it's also in the realm of feelings, often referred to as the astral plane or the kamic plane, the mental plane, the realm of thoughts and ideas. Why do you think Leibniz and Descartes both came up with calculus at the same time, or so many inventions are spawned in the same time period? It's because conscious beings are utilizing the same finite materials, whether they're mental, emotional, or physical, or higher up, such as volitional. They are using all these materials congregated together as this material plane Mayic presentation. This is where does the presentation end for you when you fall asleep? Hardly. What do you leave behind in your consciousness? Well, you leave your body behind. When you get up in the morning, do you say to yourself, I feel rested? Or I feel I didn't sleep well? Or I had this dream? What was dreaming if your consciousness went to sleep entirely? There's some part of your consciousness that was still awake. This is the continuing consciousness. So, recapitulating, we've got bodily consciousness, perspectival consciousness, the feeling or emotional consciousness, the emotional self, the narrating consciousness, what I've called the the narrating or intellectual self. The volitional self, right? That's entirely different. I can feel one way about something, but I can certainly will to do something else. And very often, we find our will in conflict with our heart or our desire. And we ask the mind to settle it. But so often, doing itself, life itself intervenes, and that project is suspended for a moment in indecision. So besides the empiric self, the epistic self of the relation, subject-object relation, and everything that magnetically clings to that polarity within your innerscape, it's all based upon a fundamental unity, which we call the agnostic self, where we all share in the same theos, logos, ethos, pathos, and bios. We all share in that one life, that one mind, as we carve it up individually through our epistic selves, in the same way we carve up the empiric world through our personality and our finite understandings, whether they're explained to us through education, our parents, or pastors, or a swami, or a lama, or your best friend or lover. Whoever it is that opens you up to the world, they're opening you up to yourself, but the two of you are being opened up together in the same flower of existence. Om Mani Padme Hum. The jewel in the center of the lotus. That's you. That's the center. All of this together is the archaic self. What is the archaic self? It is all three selves working as one. Death of the body is not death of consciousness. The reality of my life cannot die, said Yogananda, for I am indestructible consciousness. Consciousness is an energy. Energy can neither be created or destroyed, only changed. So will you consciously change your energy, as Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras prescribes when he says, yoga is the control of the modifications of the mind. So by controlling these modifications, we are united with reality. Reality in all its aspects, in its four facets, its ingredients, in its ever-changing ramifications upon the one ground, the one identified self. The bodily self, the emotional self, or let's take it from the perspectival. The bodily, the perspectival, then the emotional or feeling self, the narrating or intellectual self, the volitional or willing self, and then the social self. How we see ourselves, or how we think others see us. All within an innerscape, so we think. But via the imagination, we are able to empathize with others. We are able to speculate on worlds that never were or never will be in this world of local causality that we call the universe. But the archaic self is the self that is this entire unity, held together by the principle of unity, having the felicity of selves, all selves, that work together, as we indicated eventually, in a socioverse. That is, where the universe is taken in hand by people who have taken Patanjali's advice, not merely as a prescription, but as a descriptive way of life. That's the way that they live. When you have a number of these individuals amalgamating on any place at any time, and at this point in our history, there are more awakened individuals than at any other time before, despite the chaos that you see around you. these individuals are creating new Edens. That is, they are creating spaces where their transformation is helping to lift others up. And when others are helped, they lift others up. When it becomes synergetic, at that point, the socioverse takes place. That is, we create a new point. We create a utopia. Whether it's an individual seer, as she sits in India and understands the nature of reality, or whether it is someone else at some far stretched corner of the world, their point of enlightenment resonates and changes the fabric of existence. Not only do each of us have individual goals that we try to pursue, but in the process, there's a larger purpose we serve, and that gets unfolded in the process. Buckminster Fuller calls this the principle of precision. And it's like the procession. It's like the procession of the equinoxes. He uses it quite differently. He gives this example, and it's a very good one, and it shows you the implications. Now, when you've got a butterfly, and they flutter about from flower to flower to flower, they're looking for what? Pollen. Bees, they're looking for pollen. They're looking for the honey, but the pollen sticks to their feet. They go. I say they're looking for the pollen. They're not. That's their purpose. But their goal is just to find the honey. The bee goes to find the honey in the flower. That's its only goal. It's not thinking of anything bigger, brighter, bolder. But in the process, on the bee's legs, the pollen sticks, goes to another flower, helps to germinate that flower, and the process will feed other bees, create other flowers. And so the process of expansion is fulfilled through purpose. And the individual bee who thinks he has only the goal of going after the honey is helping in this greater purpose. And that's the way it is with all of us. I may think I have a goal of presenting number 12 today and wrapping it up successfully. All right, that may be my goal. However, there's a larger purpose I serve, and I may not even see it. And that's often the case with any of us. We do not see the larger agnostic context in which we are embedded, not only here on the material plane, but also in the realm of emotions. It's only our perspective that's limited and says, well, I'm just going to take the perspective here of a finite, three-dimensional human being trapped in a corporeal body. That's just matter and physical universe, and that's all there is. Well, you're living a pretty shallow existence if you're going to scrape away feelings. Pretty shallow existence if you're scraping away all the mental content and the imaginations that go into enriching this life. It's a very shallow existence that one would adhere to by holding to such a frozen perspective. And as we discussed, that's really where you make the change in terms of the archaic transformations of ethos, where you are the archaic sense, your moral sense. And ethos, that is the set of will energies that brings about our ability to be creative, as well as to be significant, purposeful, and goal-oriented through our character and through our perspective. However, as we've spoken about, doxa, that is these frozen elements of perspective, where you are held by sanctions and by opinions and passions and addictions. These are the complete opposite of the freedoms that occur when you practice self-transformation through the two aspects of self-realization and self-cultivation, and you open yourself up to darsha, that is, to these inclusive feelings, thoughts, intentions. The more inclusive your intentions become, the more powerful and sovereign you become, paralogically, as a human being. Because the human being is the pivot, the point, if you will, the balance point between the circumference of the sphere of all and the center or the point. To bring our seminar to the apotheosis of understanding, we're going to take another triune view of the self in a moment, after I catalog the last of our dimensions. So we have the bodily, the perspectival, the emotional, the narrating or intellectual, the volitional or willing self, the social self, the continuing self, the unifying self, the advancing self, and the one self, the self-identifying self, the self that seals its identity on every single ego, whether it's your empiric self with its empirical ego that says, I'm here, I feel this, I'm in this space, I'm waving my hand, I'm doing this, all the finite things that you could describe as a personality, or whether it's your epistic self, and where you are there a transcendental ego, and you realize that you're the subject that has always stood and always stands in every relationship, every finite relationship. You're transfinite. You're not finite, you're transfinite. You're flying through every finite experience like you're some kind of cosmic vibratory string threading the beads, the constructs, the cognizances of your states of experience. So with these 10 dimensions of self, each one of them exists, whether it is myself or yourself or his self or their self. And it is these dimensions of self that are held together contemplatively and in one's own experience when we consider what I call the stanzas of synergia. The stanzas of synergia really are based upon a conception that the one self consists of the fully expanded I consciousness. That's what the one self is, the fully expanded I consciousness. And all selves share this trait. They share the trait of what in Tantra is called the continuously arising great mantra of I, aham, I am, I. This arises in every being. So all selves, all share this seal of identity, of the I. It is a continuously arising great mantra. It is something that happens inasically. It is the transcendent ego in each of us, the ego that shares, if you will, in Dharmakaya, that is, in the realm that is unnamed, ineffable, without measure, without discernible quality, without anything that can be affirmed of it that actually captures it. its unity par excellence, its identity in itself. So we are going to conclude today with a look at what I call the stanzas of synergia, where the point is the center, the plenum that is being referred to is the entire sphere. And try to think of a crystalline sphere, if you will, are totally transparent. And the pivot is a radial octahedron. So all the octahedrons that I've been building along here and that I've been talking about, considering it like a pulsing plasmic flower. It is essentially any individual as they are transforming through self-realization and self-cultivation and bringing about the fruits of wisdom and bliss and virtue and skill. When these are being developed, wherever the individual at, it's a utopian point. The stanzas of synergia go like this. The point pivots the plenum points the pivot, and the pivot plenizes the point. Each one of these has to be looked at from a macrocosmic point of view, that is the whole thing. One's individual point of view is the microcosm, that is one of the things, definable entities within the whole thing. And then the things that make you up as a thing, the microcosms. Looking at each of these stanzas in terms of the macrocosm, the microcosm, and the minocosm, we see when we're talking about that the point pivots the plenum. And remember, we're talking about the point is the center, and the plenum is the sphere, and the pivot is the radiooctahedron. This is what's pivoting. And you can take a look and you can see, well, the pholanosic self reaches the entire circumference, whereas the epistic self, the second octahedron represented here, is your epistic self. It's less expanded. And even more contracted is your empirical self. Now remember, this is simply a representation, but you get the idea how the greater includes the lesser. And the more powerful and potent is what gives substance and source to that which is subaltern and which hangs for its substantial support upon a higher level of reality. The point pivots the plenum. In terms of the macrocosm, that means the one self creates the omniverse. In terms of the microcosm, it means, that is you, one's consciousness centers the world. My consciousness centers my world as a microcosmic beam. Minicosmically, talking about the cells in my kneecap, etc., the infinitesimal composes the whole. Now think about that. We think we've taken the infinitesimal down to the basic, the basic physical subatomic strata. Have we? Perhaps. Even if we have, it approaches the infinitesimal. And those are the things that actually compose the whole in terms of the points that are going to pivot the plenum. Now when it comes to the plenum points the pivot. And in terms of the macrocosm, that means the paraverse universizes the multiverse. The paraverse is the entire potential of being. It is inexhaustible. You can create an infinite or an infinitude of multiverses, and you have still not touched a zillionth of what the paraverse is in terms of the source of power, truth, goodness, and beauty. It is ineffable. However, from that ineffable universe, all the multiverses that could be imagined or conceived, this one that we're in now gets universizes. It's our universe with local causality, right? With sections that I perceive of any time, of space. All of it's connected. I see only a part of it, you see only a part of it, all of it being connected. The structure is what we call filled space. In terms of the microcosm, the transcendent, which we spoke of, is immanent in the efflorescent. Now, the efflorescent, and I've deliberately let that bleed into this diagram, because the efflorescent is actually the archaic self. It's the archaic self as it works in the gnostic self of union, the epistic self of felicity, bliss, ecstasy, and the empiric self of our finite world, where the principle of utility reigns supreme. In terms of the plenum points the pivot for the minicosm, that means the whole, the plenum, establishes, that is, points, every part. The whole knows where the point belongs. That becomes one's moria, one's lot, one's part of life to play. When you are a subaltern part of a greater microcosmic whole. The third stanza, the pivot, plenizes the point. From the macrocosmic point of view, that means that consciousness actualizes being. From the microcosmic point of view, that means the individual consciousness expands to infinity. Each of us are capable of expanding our consciousness from the finite through the transfinite to the infinite. And from the minicosmic point of view, the parts, or these particles, dimensionalize the dimensionless. The dimensionless, the point, can appear everywhere. And therefore, there's no problem in establishing an infinity of selves. As Rabelais said, God is like an infinite intellectual sphere with its circumference nowhere and its point everywhere. And so you've seen that according to these scales of self, pardon me one moment. You've seen that according to these scales of self, whether we're looking at the one self or all selves or this self, what appears to be a hierarchy is really an identity. And that's why I use the aeon and the omniversal model as an explanatory tool where no matter what it is, whether it's myself as a microcosm, I can use the aeonic structure, the aeon, as microcosm. I can look at the entirety as the macrocosm, and under the eye of the aeon, A-E-O-N. And it's the aeon that allows us, and that's basically what this is. Remember, this is what we spoke of in terms of, and as you can tell, I did not take every single one of the cogno cards that have been developed and posterize them. However, back to the aeon, here we have up here, that's composed, of course, of Atma, conscious being, the Apeiron, boundless being or pure being, Aletheia, this finite world we see in abhava, or non-being. Those are the four ingredients to reality. Alea, the storehouse, where everything is taking place, the cauldron of conscious being, non-being, finite being, and pure being. So, having considered the stanzas of Synergia today, we're going to conclude with step 9, which is individualizing identity. Now, I'm going to put this up here, and we can take a look at it together. In this self-transformational evolving practice, answer the question posed in session 1. Who am I? But you're going to do this by directly experiencing your identity individually perspectivized through one of the selves. So, as the empiric self, that is the person with the ever-changing finite acts and feelings and thoughts and intents, that's one way. That's one perspective that you're going to answer the question, who am I from? The other is the epistic self, that is the psyche or the soul, as your self-evident self-awareness. And what is it doing? It's apprehending the noia, the contents of experience that are generated by the 5 transfinite faculties. We spoke of those. Self at perception, right? You're always aware. Awareness is always aware of what's going on in itself. Even if liminally you're not aware of all of it, your full consciousness is the entirety of who you are is. And so there's apperception, thinking, feeling, willing, intending, doing, in the experiential moment of memory, attention, and expectancy. I've got to draw your attention to that. Under the faculties of self here, I have emboldened a box because all 3 of these aspects, memory, attention, and expectancy. Now, that's not the same thing as expectance. That's frozen expectancy. But we all have that sense of being thrust into the future. That's faith. Faith is of 5 kinds. First of all, you've got cosmic faith. That's what gives you a sense of stability in a well-ordered world that's law-governed. Next, you have human faith. You have faith in your fellow man that they're not going to blow themselves to kingdom come. That gives you a sense of security, and whenever that's threatened, you feel insecure on the human side of faith. Your faith in humans is undermined. Just like if all of a sudden we started seeing stars wink out of existence, our sense of cosmic stability would be undermined. The other kind of faiths that we have are socials, and that's trust. When you learn about another person, the expectancy you have is you are rushing into this future, pretending all the time, includes that sense of social trust that you've established in an organic relationship with somebody you know in face-to-face contact. That's trust. That is social faith. You also have a kind of personal faith. Sanity. That's what your present is thrusting you forward into the future as a sane human being. You have every personal faith that you are going to retain your sanity. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Your sense of sanity is that evidence of things not seen. Your thoughts, your feelings, are they harmonious? Are they reliable? If they are, you're a sane human being. You have personal faith, faith in yourself. And the last kind of faith you have is animal faith. And that's reliance on your environment. I'm relying on the floor to hold me. I'm relying on the air to support my breathing as well as for me to cut it effortlessly. I'm relying on so many things in this animal faith we share with animals. When they dodge something that's chasing them, they're not going through a propositional phase of doubt and going, well, I don't know if that thing is real. Immediately they take off because they have animal faith. That's the substance of things hoped for. They have faith. They have reliance on this ground that when they take off, the ground is going to hold them with traction. So just in the same way that you have these 5 kinds of faith, that is the expectancy as you move in the eternal now, in this eternal moment, there's this aspect of expectancy in these 5-fold facets, but you also have attention going on. You have this self-perception that's taking place. I know who I am at all times. I'm perceiving my own consciousness. At the same time, I have intentionality. I'm a subject that is intending an object. I'm in an intentional relationship, subject-object relationship. At the same time, there's an extensional relationship that's taking place in terms of my attention, because I realize that even though I'm paying attention here to this camera, I am embedded in a sea of physical elements in relationship to one another in certain structures and configurations. That's my extension as part of my attention. But I also have retention. I'm able to retend through memory other things that are going on that have happened decades ago or days ago. They are all objects that I retend. And in the same way, I'm protending. My objects of consciousness are something that anticipate the future, and that's turns into this expectancy that we're speaking of as that forward-facing element of the eternal now. In the same way that the backward-facing element is your memory. And your memory is of 5 types as well. The first memory that you have is the memory of yourself. You recognize yourself. It's called amnusis. In Tantra, it's called pratyabhija. It's the recognition of who you are. As you move up the 10 dimensions of reality, you eventually understand that you are the one self. Biographic is the story you have of yourself, built by your will. That's quite different than conceptual memory, where I can conceive of 2 + 2 is 4, independent of the episode, where I might have learned it in the 3rd grade. That episode or whatever, I don't recall anymore, but I do have the conceptual memory, although I don't have the precise episodic memory of when I learned it, under whom, in what class, on what day, at what time. But we do have episodic memories. I'm going to remember this in the day and the time, of course. And then there is the semiotic, and that is your signs. Every word it denotes an actual object, such as board. It denotes one of these. Let's call it a trifold board. Can denote one of those. But it also connotes something, its meaning. Now, that meaning is nowhere down there. You're not going to find the meaning of any of this by looking closer. You're going to find the meaning of what I'm talking about when I say that one has triliminal consciousness. There is liminality, that is what you're paying attention to at the moment, and then there's supraliminality, and that is all those facets of logos, pathos, ethos, bios, all your life potentials and the things that have been structured as your virtues and as your character. These things exist even though you're not paying attention to them, going, I'm such a truthful guy, or I feel such great love for so-and-so. Yeah, all of that down here in the empiric realm, that actual feeling of love for so-and-so, or the actual designation of anything as a particular act, all of this is actually happening at one time, but there are so many subliminal elements that are occurring. I don't for a moment have the whole dictionary at my disposal when I'm speaking. I'm not using the dictionary as I speak yet. Out of 26 letters, think of this, we can build not only a book and not only charts, we can build a library. Just 26 elements. Arrange them in different ways. Look at the infinitude, the near infinitude. The profligacy of the word. And that's just the logos, the truth element that's manifesting. And when you stop and think about all the mental energy that is massified in each book through 26 letters of the alphabet, you get an idea of the fecundity and the creativity that this omniverse has to offer. The omniverse is that paraverse. It is the multiverse. And it is this universe in which local causality and known and knowable entities, intelligible entities, are experienced. The multiverse is not something that we can access causally. We can imaginatively leapfrog over to another multiverse, but actually we can't, because actuality has to do with local causality being here and their local causalities being there at the time, and all of those local causalities are held together within a paraverse which itself is inexhaustible. So, today, when we're speaking of memory, attention, and expectancy, we're saying all of that, all three of those functions of the memory of the past, the expectancy of the future, and the attention of the present, all of that is happening all the time. That's what we mean by the eternal now. And when we're talking about all of these different aspects of the self and the will and the love and the mind and life, these are what is self-presence in presencing. When we're talking about the present moment, as part of presencing, every present moment has this presencing. It has all of these faculties taking place at one time. You can understand, therefore, the depth of the lotus that you are experiencing in something such as contemplation, or just paying attention to what you're doing throughout the day. You are unfolding different levels of your dimensionalized existence as a conscious being. And you will realize in the anasic self, or the pneuma, as the experiencer, which remember is the watcher and the actor, both at the same time, happening at the same time. This experiencer is this pure, undifferentiated awareness of infinite power, truth, beauty, and goodness. Demonstrated, as we've talked about, the fruits of self-transformation, skills, sagacity, serenity, and sovereignty. So, the actual exercise after all of this is, enter the door of self-consciousness through the awakening mantra, I am conscious of being conscious. Walk through that door, and from each of these three perspectives, answer, who am I? Now, I'm going to go down to the note. When you're going to identify with each perspective, answer in that perspective's vocabulary. So, for ordinary finite language, you're going to use that when answering as a person, as this self. Intuitive, transitive meanings when answering as a conscious being, where you're going to identify as a conscious being with all selves. And then unitive, holistic, paralogical, wordless silence, when it comes to answering the question, who am I, as I, thou, being at one. So from each of the three perspectives, answer this question. Who am I? As this self, my everyday empiric self, finite perspective composing my unique, idiosyncratic willings, thinkings, feelings, and doings, all individualizing my identity in the context of my natural, cultural, and social environments. Next, I am going to look at it from the angle of all selves, with my epistic self's transfinite perspective on the entirety of sentient beings throughout the omniverse in all its aspects and dimensionalities, of which I am identified in a complex relation to the interdependent whole. You know, if the finite universe could all be propositionalized, be put into propositions and given symbolic meanings, the meaning for me would be exactly the absence of the meaning for everything else. If you wanted to find out what I am, just define everything else, and from the aspect of the whole would look down and go, oh, Tristan is missing. That's what we're referring to here. And finally, from the agnostic level of the one self, look at the agnostic self's infinite perspective on all nature, that is the whole and the parts, upon the ground of reality, making every individual, including me and you, a self-reflective ray of singular identity, the one and only identity of every and all. My friends, it's been my great honor to be able to have presented to you these 12 different series in a seminar on self. Now, after this seminar, I plan to do a couple of 3 other series, and one will be on an introduction to omni-philosophy, where I'll be going over omniversalism, omniterics, and omnilectics. That is, the theories of philosophy, and then getting down to the basics of philosophy, where you do critical analysis, worldview building, and intuitive experiencing, as well as the products of philosophic experience. For instance, omnilectically speaking, in terms of omni-philosophy, these are my productions. These are my omnilectics. Omnilectics is actually producing something from all your theorizing, all your experiencing, all your critiquing and worldview building. You produce something out of that. So I will be doing a series on an introduction to omni-philosophy. I am going to continue presenting special topics on selfology. That's what all of this is. So I will continue a seminar on self, and we will simply call it selfology, and we will be working with several topics. But then I also I want you to understand that whether it's the selfology, which we'll be continuing this in some detail, or omniphilosophy, where we're actually speaking about a meta-theory for combining all points of view, whether they're philosophical, scientific, religious, artistic, whatever. There's going to be a 3rd series that I would like to participate in, and that is Utopian Dialogues, where people who are helping in the process of self-transformation in their own communities, or personally, or in collectives, other types of groups, and are making an impact upon the world. And I will be, rather than in a monologue format, as I'm prone to do here, will be undertaking a dialogue format. So as I said, I'm grateful to all of you for allowing me this time to speak to you and to present some of the basics here of the self. So until the next time that we meet, behave when you must. Be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.